Wyoming Territory. January 1883. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, gnawing at anything foolish enough to brave its fury. Snow whipped across the barren land, swallowing the trail whole. At the edge of a frozen thicket, a lone cabin fought back with thin tendrils of smoke curling from its chimney. Outside, a figure in a tattered brown duster coat lurched through the blizzard like a ghost. Jesse Colter saw her just as the sun bled into the horizon. He'd spent the day riding the perimeter of his land, his bones aching from the cold, his Winchester snug against his back. When the woman collapsed face first into the snow, he didn't hesitate. "Hell's bells," he growled, spurring his buckskin forward. He reached her in seconds, swinging down before his horse even settled. Her face was a map of frostbite lips, split eyes, wild but clear. She clawed at his sleeve, her voice a sandpaper whisper. "The wagon! My boys!" Jesse didn't ask questions. He wrapped her in his coat, tossed her over his saddle like a sack of grain, and made for the cabin. "You ain't dyin' on my watch," he muttered, though she'd already gone limp. Inside, he dumped every quilt he owned onto her shivering frame, then grabbed a coil of rope and a whiskey flask. "For the pain," he told the empty air, though he knew damn well it was for his own nerves. The storm had erased everything but his mare. Daisy caught the scent of fear. The wagon was a snowdrift with wheels. Inside, two boys, maybe 6 and 8, curled together like fawns. The older one brandished a rusted pocket knife. "You touch my brother, I'll cut ya," he spat, teeth chattering. Jesse almost smiled. "Save it for the wolves, kid," he said, pouring whiskey down their throats before bundling them against his chest. Back at the cabin, the woman Lillian Graves, she croaked, watched him peel frozen socks off her son's feet. "We were bound for Silver Creek," she said, voice cracking. "After the fever took my Henry." Jesse shoved a tin cup of broth into her hands. "Well, ma'am, Silver Creek ain't going nowhere, and neither are you." For 3 days, the storm raged. Jesse taught the boys to play poker with corn kernels. Lillian mended his shirts with hands that shook less each day. On the 4th morning, sunlight shattered the ice on the windows. The younger boy, Eli, pressed a crudely carved wooden horse into Jesse's palm. "For saving us," he said. Jesse cleared his throat, suddenly fascinated by his bootlaces. "Ain't nothing," he lied. That night, Lillian stood at the stove, humming. Jesse watched her silhouette against the firelight, the way her hair caught the glow like prairie grass at sunset. Outside, the wind had finally lost its teeth. Somewhere in the quiet, something deeper than survival took root. The morning sun turned the snow into a sea of diamonds as Jesse Colter swung his axe into a stubborn log. Inside the cabin smelled of coffee and burnt biscuits, Lillian's latest attempt at cooking. Eli and Sam, the 2 boys he'd pulled from that frozen wagon, were now sprawled on the floor, using charcoal to draw battle scenes on scraps of old newspaper. Jesse watched them through the open door, his breath fogging in the air. Lillian stepped beside him, her fingers brushing snow from his sleeve. "You'll wear yourself out before noon," she said, her voice softer than it had been a week ago. Jesse wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Someone's got to keep this place running," he grunted. She didn't move away. Instead, she reached for the axe. "Let me." Jesse raised an eyebrow, but handed it over. Lillian swung with surprising force, splitting the log clean in 2. Eli whooped from the doorway. "Ma, you're stronger than Pa ever was." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Lillian's grip tightened on the axe handle, but before the silence could turn heavy, Jesse snatched up the split wood. "Guess that means you're chopping from now on," he said, tossing her a grin. That night, as the fire crackled, Sam tugged at Jesse's sleeve. "You ever shot a bear?" Jesse leaned back in his chair. "Shot one boy. I once wrestled one for a jar of honey." The kid's eyes widened. Even Lillian paused her mending. "You're lying," Sam accused. Jesse held up his right arm, revealing 4 jagged scars. "Bear didn't think so." Lillian set aside her sewing. You never told me that. Jessie shrugged. Wasn't important. But the way she looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time made his throat tighten. The next morning, Jessie found Lillian standing at the edge of the property, staring at the distant mountains. Silver Creek's still out there, she said quietly. Jessie spat into the snow. So's winter, and wolves, and 100 miles of nothing. She turned to him, her eyes fierce. I won't be a charity case, Jessie. He stepped closer, close enough to see the freckles the sun had burned across her nose last summer. Who said anything about charity? His voice dropped. I got a deed took 160 acres, a barn that don't leak, and 2 boys who've started calling me sir instead of mister. He took her calloused hand in his. Only thing missing's a woman stubborn enough to keep up with me. Lillian's breath hitched. Then, with a suddenness that startled them both, she yanked him forward and kissed him hard. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed. That a yes? Jessie asked, dazed. She smirked. That's a we'll see. Behind them, Eli whooped again, and Sam started chanting, Ma's got a bow, as they raced back to the cabin. Jessie didn't mind the teasing, not when Lillian's fingers stayed tangled with his, not when the wind carried the sound of her laughter over the snow, bright and alive like a promise. The green wool lay folded on the bed, untouched. Lillian ran her fingers over it once more before turning to the trunk. The rusted latch groaned as she lifted it, revealing her late husband's tools, a draw knife, a mallet, a set of iron hoops worn smooth by years of use. Eli crept up beside her, his small hand hovering over the tools. Can I? He whispered. Jessie appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands. Boy wants to learn his father's trade, Lillian said, her voice thick. Jessie nodded and crouched next to Eli. First lesson, Oak's stubborn as a mule. Gotta respect it. He guided the boy's hand to the draw knife, adjusting his grip. Now show me how you'd shave this down. Outside, Sam whooped as he chased a barn cat through the snow. The sound made Lillian smile, but her eyes stayed on Jessie, the careful way he watched Eli's hands, the patience in his voice. That evening, as Jessie mended a harness by lamplight, Lillian set a cup of coffee beside him. You're good with him, she said. Jessie kept his eyes on the leather. Had a teacher like that once. Man didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. Lillian hesitated, then pulled a small bundle from her apron, a faded photograph of a man with Eli's smile. I thought I'd packed this away, she murmured. Jessie studied it quietly. He'd be proud of those boys, he said finally. And of you. The next morning, Jessie hitched the wagon for town. The mercantile was bustling, but as Lillian counted out coins for sugar, a man in a bowler hat shouldered up to the counter. Heard you're the new Mrs. Colter, he drawled, eyes flicking to Jessie. Funny. Last I checked, widows don't remarry so quick unless there's money involved. The room went silent. Jessie's hand froze on his rifle stock, but it was Lillian who stepped forward, her voice like chilled steel. You check a lot of widows' business, Mr. Hargrove, or just the ones whose land borders yours. Hargrove's face darkened. Jessie moved, then positioning himself between them. Best tend to your own accounts, he said, low and dangerous. Before I start wondering why you're so interested in mine. The ride home was tense. Sam chattered about candy, but Eli kept glancing at Jessie's rigid shoulders. As they crested the hill, Lillian reached over and squeezed Jessie's wrist. I won't have you brawling over my honor, she said dryly. Jessie's mouth twitched. Wasn't planning to brawl. Was planning to shoot him. Lillian laughed then, bright and sudden, and the sound carried across the snow like a promise of home of defiance, of something neither of them dared name yet. That night she cut the green wool into pieces, not for a dress, for a shirt, one that would fit Jessie's broad shoulders perfectly. The green wool took shape under Lillian's fingers, not a dress, but a shirt for Jessie, with seams strong enough to last through seasons of hard work. She stitched by the firelight while the boys slept, the rhythm of the needle steady as a heartbeat. One evening, Jessie came in from the barn to find her biting off a thread, her mouth curved in quiet satisfaction. "Turned thief, did you?" he said, nodding at the shirt. Lillian held it up. "Try it on before you accuse me." The fabric stretched across his shoulders like it was made for him. Jessie ran a hand down the front, his calluses catching on the fine stitching. "Hell of a trade," he murmured. "A shirt for a roof over your head." Lillian stood brushing sawdust from her skirt. "It's not a trade." Her fingers lingered on his sleeve. "It's a promise." The next morning, Jessie rode out early to check the north pasture. He found Hargrove's men stringing wire across the creek on Colter land. Jessie dismounted, slow his hand resting on his colt. "You boys lost." The taller one spat tobacco. "Survey says this is Hargrove land now." Jessie smiled cold as the creek water. "Survey's wrong." By sundown, the sheriff stood on Jessie's porch hat in hand. "Hargrove's claiming you threatened his men." Lillian stepped forward before Jessie could speak. "And I suppose those men just forgot to mention they were stealing land." Her voice could have cut glass. The sheriff shifted his weight. "Ma'am, it's his word against mine." Jessie tossed a folded paper at the sheriff's chest. The original land grant signed in 1872. "Tell Hargrove next time he sends snakes, I'll send them back headless." That night, Lillian sat on the porch steps, Jessie's green shirt sleeve brushing her shoulder. "You could have gotten yourself shot today," she said. Jessie tilted his head toward the barn, where Eli and Sam were guarding the property with sticks. "Had backup." Lillian laughed, but her grip on his arm tightened. Come Sunday, they rode into town together, Jessie in his new shirt, Lillian with her chin high. Hargrove watched from the saloon steps, his face sour as week-old milk. At the church door, Jessie paused. "You ready for this?" Lillian adjusted Sam's collar. "For hymns and hypocrisy," she smirked. "I was born ready." As they stepped inside, the whispers followed about the widow who'd tamed Jessie Colter, about the land dispute, about the way Jessie's hand never left the small of Lillian's back. And when the preacher spoke of forgiveness, Lillian leaned close to Jessie's ear. "I'd rather have justice." Jessie's thumb brushed her wedding band, a simple copper thing he'd forged himself. "You'll get both," he promised. Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming rain, of turned earth, of something new taking root. The rain drummed a steady rhythm on the roof as Lillian tied the last herb pouch with twine. Outside the garden, shimmered under the downpour, the bean leaves trembling with each drop. Jessie came in shaking water from his hat, his boots leaving dark prints on the floorboards. "Creek's rising," he said, hanging his duster by the door. "Another day of this, and we'll need to move the sheep to higher ground." Sam looked up from his whittling, his knife stilling. "Can I help?" Jessie ruffled the boy's hair. "Reckon I'll need my best scout." Eli, ever the worrier, frowned at the window. "What if the whole valley floods?" Lillian set a steaming cup of coffee in front of Jessie before answering. "Then we'll build an ark, like Noah," she said, winking at Jessie over the rim of her own cup. The lines around his eyes crinkled a smile he saved just for her. That afternoon, as the rain lightened to a drizzle, Lillian pulled the half-finished calico dress from her sewing basket. The fabric was the color of sagebrush after a storm, with tiny white flowers that reminded her of the prairie stars blooming by the creek. She'd been saving it for Sunday services, but as she held it up to the light, an idea took root. "Rosie," she called, "fetch me the blue ribbon from the trunk." The girl scampered off, returning with not just the ribbon, but a tarnished silver thimble. "Grandma's," she announced, pressing it into Lillian's palm. Lillian's breath caught. She'd thought all of Henry's family heirlooms were lost on the trail. Turning it in the light, she noticed initials scratched inside EH for Eleanor Hartwell, the mother-in-law she'd never met. Jessie found her still staring at it when he came in for supper. Without a word, he took the thimble and slid it onto her finger, like a ring. "Fits," he observed, his rough thumb brushing her knuckle. That night, with the children asleep and the fire banked low, Lillian worked the thimble into the dress's hem, a hidden stitch of memory and new beginnings. Jesse watched from the bed, his voice a rumble in the dark. "You sewing our history into that thing." Lillian bit off the thread. "Just making sure it lasts." The next morning dawned clear, the world washed clean. Jesse rode out early with the boys to check the fences, while Lillian and Rosie gathered rain-heavy blackberries by the creek. The calico dress hung unfinished on the line, the wet fabric clinging to its shape like a ghost. Rosie plopped a berry into her mouth, staining her fingers purple. "Will you teach me to sew like that?" Lillian tucked a loose curl behind the girl's ear. "When you're older. But I want to make Pa a vest with pockets." Lillian stilled. Pa. The word hung between them, sweet as the berries in their pail. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, Jesse's laughter carried on the wind, mingling with the boys' whoops. Rosie tugged her sleeve. "You're smiling." Lillian lifted the pail onto her hip. "Come on, little bird. Let's go home." And as they walked through the glistening grass, the calico dress fluttered on the line behind them. Not just fabric and thread, but a flag, planted deep in the earth of their belonging. The scent of wet pine lingered in the air as Lillian stood on the porch, her fingers tightening around Jesse's calloused hand. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, not the sharp crack of a storm, but the low, persistent growl of something gathering strength. Inside, Rosie's laughter floated through the open window as Eli helped her sound out words on the slate. "C-A-T? No, wait, that's a D." The sound should have warmed her, but Lillian's shoulders stayed tense. Jesse's thumb brushed her wrist. "You've got that look," he murmured. Lillian exhaled slowly. "Remember that peddler who came through last week? The one who wouldn't meet my eyes." Jesse's grip shifted subtly, his body angling toward the tree line as if expecting trouble. "The one with the cracked boot heel. He asked too many questions about our stock, about the north pasture." She nodded toward the darkening horizon. "And now the cattle are restless. They know something we don't." A branch snapped in the cottonwoods. Jesse didn't reach for his gun, but Lillian felt the coiled readiness in him. "Could be wolves," he said. "Could be men who think a widow's land is easy picking." The next morning, Jesse rode out at first light. He returned with mud splattered to his knees and a grim set to his jaw. Found tracks near the salt lick. 2 riders, one favoring his left mount. Lillian handed him a tin cup of bitter coffee. Hargrove's man limps. Eli, eavesdropping from the woodpile, dropped an armload of kindling with a clatter. "They gonna try to take our cows?" Jesse drained the cup in one swallow. "Not if we move them first." By noon, the whole family was herding the cattle up to the high meadow. Rosie whooped like a Comanche warrior, her braids flying as she darted after strays. Eli, suddenly solemn beyond his years, kept glancing at the rifle strapped to Jesse's saddle. Lillian rode alongside Jesse, her skirts hitched up to her knees. "You taught them this," she said quietly. "How to fight for what's theirs." Jesse's gaze lingered on the children. "Had a good teacher." That night, as a half moon silvered the pasture, Lillian sat by the campfire, stitching a torn hem. Jesse emerged from the shadows with 2 steaming mugs. "Peppermint," he said, handing her one. "For the nerves." She inhaled the sharp scent, then froze. A new sound threaded through the night, not coyotes, but the distant creak of saddle leather. Jesse didn't move. "How many?" Lillian closed her eyes, listening. 3, maybe 4. She reached for the shotgun, leaning against the log, but it was Eli's voice that cut through the dark high and clear from his watchpost in the oak tree. "Pa, they're circling the south ridge." Jesse stood slowly, his silhouette blocking the firelight. "You take Rosie to the dugout," he told Lillian. His hand brushed hers, not a goodbye, but a promise. Lillian grabbed his wrist. "We do this together." The moon slid behind a cloud as they moved into position, the land itself holding its breath. Somewhere in the blackness, a horse snorted, a boot-scuffed stone, then silence. When the shot came, it wasn't from Jesse's rifle. It was from Eli's. 22 aimed carefully over the rustlers' heads, followed by the boy's piercing whistle. The cattle erupted into motion, stampeding straight toward the trespassers. By the time the dust settled, the only things left on the south ridge were trampled hats and the acrid scent of fear. Back at the campfire, Jesse gripped Eli's shoulder. "Reckon you just earned your first cattleman's wage." Lillian said nothing. But when she tucked the children into their bedrolls, her hands lingered an extra moment on each small head. The next morning, as dawn pinked the sky, she found Jesse skinning a rabbit for breakfast. Without a word, she pressed the peppermint leaves into his palm, their edges slightly torn from being clutched too tight. Jesse folded his fingers around hers. "They'll be back." Lillian watched Rosie chase a grasshopper through the dew. "Let them." High above a hawk circled its shadow, stitching their story into the land below. The first frost painted the valley in silver as Jesse rode out to meet Henry Bloor at the property line. The man stood waiting beside his sway-backed gelding, his breath curling in the crisp air. Up close, Jesse noticed the faded cavalry tattoo on Henry's wrist, the mark of a man who'd served under Sherman. "Mrs. Colter says you can fix a roof," Jesse said, dismounting. Henry spat tobacco juice into the frozen grass. "Fixed worse." His gaze drifted past Jesse to where Lillian stood on the porch, her hand resting on Eli's shoulder. Something flickered in the man's eyes, not threat, but recognition. "That your boy?" Jesse shifted just enough to block his view. "Mine now." Henry nodded slowly, then turned to study the sagging barn roof. 3 days' work if the weather holds. By afternoon, Henry was hauling shingles up the ladder while Jesse worked below, ripping fresh cedar shakes. Lillian brought them coffee, her boots crunching on the frost-stiffened grass. "You served in the war," she said, handing Henry the steaming cup. Henry's fingers tightened around the tin. "5th Ohio Cavalry. You." "My brother rode with Quantrill." The words hung between them, heavy as the frost. Jesse's axe stilled. Henry took a long sip before answering. "War's over." He met Lillian's gaze. "So's the hate." That night, Lillian found Jesse oiling his revolver by lamplight. "You're quiet," she said, sitting across from him. Jesse spun the cylinder. "Man doesn't just forget being on the wrong end of a guerrilla raid." Lillian reached for his hand, stilling it. "He lost people too. His whole family's buried outside Vicksburg. How do you—" Rosie brought him lunch. He gave her a carved whistle. She turned Jesse's palm up, tracing the scars there. "Some men carry their wounds where you can see them." 3 days turned into 5. Henry repaired not just the roof, but the loose stall doors, his hands steady and sure. On the last evening, as the sun bled across the frost-kissed prairie, he handed Jesse a folded paper. "Land survey from '78, Henry said. "Shows your property line runs 20 paces past that cottonwood. Hargrove's been grazing his cattle on your grass." Jesse studied the map, then looked up sharply. "Why show me this?" Henry mounted his gelding, the saddle creaking. "Because some men need to learn what over means." As he rode away, Lillian came to stand beside Jesse, her shawl pulled tight. "Think he'll find what he's looking for?" Jesse watched the lone figure disappear into the twilight. He already did. That night the wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow. Jesse lay awake, listening to the quiet sounds of his family breathing. Eli's soft snores, Rosie's murmured dreams, Lillian's steady warmth beside him. Outside, the unfinished horse carving sat on the porch rail, waiting. But for the first time in years, Jesse didn't feel the restlessness that came with waiting. The war was over. The winter was coming. And his hands, like Henry's, like Lillian's, had work to do. The cedar bough filled the cabin with its sharp, clean scent, the yarn-wrapped berries catching firelight like tiny lanterns. Lillian knelt beside Rosie, helping her tie the last paper star to the tree, a lopsided thing cut from an old almanac page. "Make a wish when you hang it," Lillian whispered. Rosie closed her eyes tight. "I wish Clara had a real dress." Jesse, who was steadying Eli on his shoulders to place the star atop the tree, caught Lillian's gaze over the children's heads. Something unspoken passed between them, a secret too new to name. That night, after the children slept with Eli's whittled soldiers and Rosie's rag doll tucked under their arms, Jesse led Lillian to the lean-to behind the kitchen. Moonlight spilled through the single window, glinting off the curved sides of a cradle. The wood, rich dark walnut, still smelled of fresh oil. Lillian's fingers trembled as she traced the scrolling Jessie had carved along the headboard, a winding vine with a single bloom at its center. "You've known," she said, not a question. Jessie pressed a calloused palm against her stomach, where their child grew unseen. "Since the day you split that oak log." His voice roughened. "Watched you swing that axe like you were born to this land." A snowflake melted against the windowpane. Then another. Outside, the world was turning white and still, but inside, Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. She turned in Jessie's arms, her back to his chest, and guided his hands around the faint curve of her belly. "Tell me the name you've been thinking," she whispered. Jessie's breath warmed her neck. "If it's a girl, Clara," Lillian finished. The wind rose, then howling around the eaves like it was trying to get in. But the cradle stood solid, and waiting its smooth curves, proof that some things, like love, like family, could weather any storm. Epilogue. 5 winters later, the smokehouse stood twice as large, and Eli's carvings, now finely detailed horses and hawks, lined the mantel. Little Clara Colter toddled after Rosie through the golden grass, her sunbonnet askew. Jessie found Lillian at the property line, watching the distant shapes of their cattle grazing near the cottonwood. Without a word, he handed her the latest letter from Henry Bloor, postmarked from Oregon Territory. She read it aloud as the wind played with her hair. "Found my place at last. It's got good soil and a woman who sings off-key. Reckon you'd approve." Jessie took the letter back, folding it carefully into his pocket. "Told you he wasn't lost," he said. "Just wandering." Lillian smiled and reached for his hand. Together they turned toward home, where the cedar bough still hung above the hearth, where the cradle waited empty but ready, where the land stretched wide and wild, and theirs. The frontier had tried to break them. Instead, it had made them whole. The years rolled across the prairie like thunderheads, some bringing gentle rains to nourish their crops, others cracking the earth with drought. But through it all, the Colter homestead stood firm as the cottonwood roots along the creek bed. By the time Clara turned 7, she could outshoot her brother Eli with a .22 and recite every wildflower name Rosie had taught her. The rag doll still sat on her bed, its embroidered name faded but legible. On summer evenings, Jessie would find Lillian in the herb garden, her fingers stained green from crushing mint, the children's laughter ringing from the pasture where they played stickball with the ranch hands. One such evening, as fireflies blinked against the purple twilight, Lillian pressed a sprig of lavender into Jessie's palm. "For your saddlebag," she said, "so you'll always carry home with you." Jessie tucked it next to his heart, right beside Henry's last letter. The paper was soft now from being handled so often, the ink blurred at the creases. But the words remained clear, a reminder that even wanderers could find their way. The winter Clara turned 12, a blizzard buried the valley under 3 feet of snow. The family huddled around the hearth, Rosie reading aloud from Ivanhoe, while Eli whittled a new chess set. Jessie caught Lillian's eye across the room and nodded toward the window where the storm raged. Without a word, she rose and joined him. Beyond the frosted glass, the world was white and wild. But inside, the fire burned steady. The cedar bough still hung above the mantel, and the cradle, now holding Clara's collection of river stones, stood witness to the life they'd built. Lillian leaned her head against Jessie's shoulder. No words were needed. The land had taught them that some loves didn't require speeches. They grew quietly like oak trees, weathering every season until their roots ran too deep to ever be torn loose. And so it was, and so they remained,